Mel Gibson was on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about the sequel to The Passion of the Christ.
He was about 6 feet tall, that he was completely scourged all over his body. He was crucified, and nobody dies for a lie.
Nearly 20 years after The Passion of the Christ shocked audiences around the world, one question continues to follow the film wherever it is discussed. How did a movie that every major Hollywood studio refused to finance become one of the most successful and controversial religious films ever made? The story behind that question is stranger than most people realize. During the production of the film, lightning struck the actor portraying Jesus.
Passion, well, I was struck by lightning on the last shot of the movie. It's well known, I've talked about it before.
Crew members began describing a strange emotional heaviness on set. Several people involved in the project later said the experience changed their lives in ways they still struggle to explain. Even Mel Gibson himself has hinted over the years that the film was never simply a professional decision. According to him, the idea felt more like something he had been pushed toward, something he could not easily walk away from, even when the entire film industry tried to shut the project down. To understand why The Passion of the Christ became one of the most debated films in modern history, you have to look beyond the headlines and examine the strange sequence of events that unfolded before the cameras ever started rolling. Because once this story began moving, it collided with forces far larger than a single movie. And many of the people who were there still say the experience never really ended. The film Hollywood refused to touch. At the beginning of the early 2000s, Mel Gibson occupied a position in Hollywood that very few filmmakers ever reach. He was already a global star, an Academy Award-winning director, and one of the most recognizable figures in modern cinema. His previous projects had earned both critical praise and enormous commercial success, which meant that if Gibson wanted to develop a new film, studios usually listened carefully. But when he began describing the project that would eventually become The Passion of the Christ, the reaction from the film industry was very different from what he had expected. The concept sounded simple on the surface. Gibson wanted to create a cinematic retelling of the final hours in the life of Jesus Christ, focusing specifically on the period between Christ's arrest and crucifixion. However, the way he intended to present the story immediately raised concerns among the executives who heard his proposal. Instead of adapting the narrative into modern English dialogue, Gibson insisted that the characters would speak the languages historically associated with first-century Judea. The Romans would speak Latin. Jesus and his followers would speak Aramaic. Audiences would follow the story through subtitles rather than familiar speech. For many studio executives, that decision alone was enough to raise alarms. Hollywood had long believed that mainstream audiences avoided subtitled films, especially in large commercial theaters. A religious historical drama spoken entirely in ancient languages sounded less like a blockbuster and more like a project destined for limited art house screenings. In addition to that unusual decision, Gibson also refused to soften the violence described in the Gospel accounts. Roman crucifixion was not a symbolic punishment or a brief moment of suffering. Historically, it was a prolonged and brutal execution designed to terrify anyone who witnessed it. Gibson believed that if the story was going to be told honestly, that reality could not be avoided. The film would not shy away from the suffering described in the biblical narrative. Instead, it would confront viewers with the physical brutality that historians and theologians had long documented. Gibson argued that without showing that reality, the emotional and spiritual weight of the crucifixion story could never fully be understood. When studio executives heard the full proposal, many of them quickly concluded that the project would be nearly impossible to market. Subtitled films traditionally perform poorly in American theaters. Graphic violence restricts audience ratings, and any film dealing with religious history carries the risk of provoking intense public debate. Beyond the financial concerns, there was also fear of controversy. The story of the crucifixion has been interpreted in different ways for centuries, and some executives worried that a realistic portrayal might ignite criticism from both religious and secular audiences. From a business standpoint, the project appeared extremely dangerous. One studio after another declined to finance it. Yet Gibson did not abandon the idea. Instead, he made a decision that surprised nearly everyone around him. Rather than waiting for the industry to approve the project, he chose to finance the entire film himself. Approximately $30 million of his own money went into the production. Another $15 million was later spent promoting the film. In total, Gibson invested roughly $45 million of his personal fortune into a project that the rest of Hollywood had already decided was too risky to touch. For many observers, that level of commitment raised an obvious question. Why would someone gamble so much on a film the entire industry had rejected? The answer begins several years earlier, during one of the most difficult periods of Gibson's life. The moment everything changed, during the late 1990s, while Mel Gibson's career continued to thrive publicly, his personal life was becoming increasingly unstable behind the scenes. He later described this period as one of deep emotional struggle. Fame, wealth, and professional success had not brought the sense of fulfillment he expected. Instead, he found himself dealing with addiction, depression, and a growing feeling that something essential was missing. Moments like that often force people to reconsider the direction of their lives. For Gibson, the turning point arrived quietly during a moment of personal desperation. He began praying, not out of habit or routine, but out of a genuine attempt to find clarity during a period when everything else seemed uncertain. According to Gibson, the experience felt less like performing a religious ritual and more like reaching for something stable in the middle of emotional chaos. In later interviews, he explained that the act of praying created a moment of stillness he had not felt in years, as if the noise surrounding his life had suddenly been muted long enough for him to hear something deeper. According to Gibson, that experience gradually led him back to Scripture. As he spent more time studying biblical texts, his attention kept returning to the same part of the gospel narrative, the final hours of Christ's life. What fascinated him was not simply the theological meaning of the story, but the physical reality of the suffering described in those accounts. Many previous films had treated the crucifixion as a brief symbolic moment. The violence was implied rather than shown. The emotional weight of the story remained present, but the physical brutality was rarely explored in detail. Gibson believed that approach overlooked something important. The crucifixion was not meant to be comfortable to witness. It was meant to reveal the depth of sacrifice involved in the story. As he studied historical accounts, Roman records, and devotional writings that described the suffering in greater detail, the idea of portraying those events with complete authenticity began to take shape in his mind. The more he read, the more convinced he became that the story had often been softened for modern audiences in ways that diluted its original impact. The more he explored the concept, the stronger the conviction became. Eventually, the project no longer felt like a typical film idea, waiting for studio approval. Instead, Gibson began describing the process as something closer to a calling. By the time he began pitching the project to Hollywood executives, he already felt committed to seeing it through. That determination would soon lead him into one of the most unusual film productions in modern cinema. A set where something felt different. Filming for The Passion of the Christ eventually took place primarily in Matera, Italy, a region known for its ancient stone architecture and rugged landscapes. The environment resembled what historians believe first-century Jerusalem may have looked like, which made it an ideal location for recreating the biblical setting. However, once production began, Several members of the cast and crew began describing an atmosphere that felt unusually intense. Many people who worked on film sets for years said they had never experienced anything quite like it. Some crew members reported sudden waves of dizziness or unexplained nausea. Others described moments of overwhelming sadness that appeared without warning during certain scenes. A few people said they felt as if the emotional weight of the story had begun affecting the entire environment. Part of this reaction may have been connected to the subject matter itself. The film's central events involved betrayal, torture, and execution, scenes that were emotionally demanding for both actors and crew members. But there were moments that felt stranger than ordinary emotional stress. Mel Gibson himself occasionally stepped away from the set during the most difficult scenes. At first, some crew members assumed he was reviewing technical aspects of the production or discussing changes with his team. Later, they realized he was praying. The intensity of the project seemed to affect nearly everyone involved in different ways. And then, the weather began behaving unpredictably. Bright mornings suddenly turned into strong winds. Dark clouds rolled across the sky during critical scenes. Dust storms occasionally forced the crew to pause filming while equipment was secured. Most productions experience weather problems at some point, but the timing of several incidents began to unsettle the people working on the film. One moment in particular would later become one of the most widely discussed events associated with the production: the lightning strike. During the filming of the crucifixion sequence, actor Jim Caviezel was positioned high on a large wooden cross built for the scene. As the crew prepared to continue filming, a bolt of lightning suddenly struck Caviezel. The electrical shock traveled through his body, stunning everyone present on set. Although Caviezel survived the strike, the incident left a lasting impact. The shock caused him to bite through his tongue and cheek, and he later developed health complications that eventually required heart surgeries. What made the moment even more extraordinary was what happened shortly afterward. Within minutes, assistant director John Michelini was also struck by lightning. Remarkably, Michelini had already been struck once earlier during the production. Two lightning strikes affecting the same small group of people within a short period of time immediately became one of the most talked about stories from the film's production. Of course, meteorologists can explain how lightning behaves during unstable weather conditions. From a scientific perspective, the events were unusual, but not impossible. Yet for many people who witnessed the incidents firsthand, the experience felt deeply unsettling. Caviezel himself continued facing additional challenges during the filming process. During the scourging scene, one of the whips accidentally struck him with enough force to leave a 14-inch wound across his back. Later, while carrying the heavy wooden cross used in the film, he slipped and dislocated his shoulder. Even the cold weather during the crucifixion scenes created problems. Caviezel spent long hours exposed on the hilltop set, while wearing minimal costume protection, which eventually pushed him toward hypothermia. Despite all of this, he continued performing the role. Some people on set noticed a detail that added to the strange atmosphere surrounding the production. Caviezel's initials were JC, and he happened to be 33 years old during filming, the same age traditionally associated with Jesus at the time of the crucifixion. Coincidence or not, the parallels added another layer of fascination to a production already surrounded by unusual events. The film that bypassed Hollywood. After filming ended, Hollywood expected the usual promotional campaign. Actors would appear on talk shows. Magazine interviews would promote the film. The marketing strategy would follow the same formula used for nearly every major release. Instead, Mel Gibson chose a completely different approach. Rather than relying on traditional entertainment media, he began showing early versions of the film to church leaders and religious communities across the United States. Private screenings were organized for pastors and ministry groups. Churches began discussing the film months before its release. This strategy created a network of anticipation that Hollywood had never seen before. Entire congregations began planning group trips to movie theaters. Religious leaders encouraged their communities to see the film together. In some cities, churches reserved entire theater auditoriums weeks in advance so that members could experience the film as a shared event, rather than simply another night at the movies. What made the strategy even more unusual was how quickly word began spreading beyond church walls. Pastors referenced the film during sermons. Christian radio stations discussed it regularly. Faith-based newsletters and community groups began organizing discussions about the historical events portrayed in the story. Without using the traditional Hollywood publicity machine, the film was quietly building an enormous grassroots audience. By the time The Passion of the Christ officially opened in theaters on February 25, 2004, millions of people already knew about it. The result stunned the film industry. On its opening day alone, the movie earned approximately $23 million. By the end of the first weekend, that number had reached more than $83 million. The momentum continued for weeks. Theater owners across the country reported sold-out screenings and unusually emotional audience reactions. Some viewers prayed together after leaving the theater, while others described the experience as one of the most intense religious films they had ever seen. Eventually, the film earned about $370 million in the United States and over $600 million worldwide, making it the highest-grossing R-rated film in history at the time. But the success also triggered an enormous wave of controversy. The debate that followed. Almost immediately after the film's release, critics and religious organizations began debating its historical and theological implications. Some groups accused the film of reinforcing anti-Semitic interpretations of the crucifixion narrative. Organizations such as the Anti-Defamation League warned that certain viewers might misunderstand the story in ways that could fuel historical prejudice. At the same time, many critics focused on the film's intense violence. Some reviewers described it as one of the most physically brutal films ever released in mainstream theaters. Reports circulated of viewers fainting during screenings. Some people required medical attention after watching the film. Others left theaters in tears. Yet, despite the controversy, or perhaps because of it, the film continued attracting massive audiences. In countries like Mexico, Poland, Brazil, and Italy, the film became a cultural event. Religious communities embraced it as one of the most powerful cinematic portrayals of Christ ever created. In other regions, particularly parts of Western Europe, the reception was far more critical. The debate surrounding the film quickly expanded beyond cinema into discussions about history, theology, and cultural memory. But the story did not end with the film's theatrical success. For several people involved in its creation, the experience left a lasting impact that continued long after the cameras stopped rolling. The lives that changed. For Mel Gibson, the years following the film's release were marked by intense personal turmoil. 2 years after The Passion of the Christ became a worldwide phenomenon, Gibson was arrested for driving under the influence. During the incident, he made anti-Semitic remarks that rapidly spread across global media. The backlash was immediate. Hollywood studios distanced themselves from him, and his reputation suffered severe damage. Talk shows, newspapers, and entertainment networks began dissecting every aspect of his personal life, often framing the scandal as the collapse of one of Hollywood's most powerful figures. Projects that once would have been offered to him without hesitation suddenly disappeared, and many people within the industry began treating him as a controversial figure rather than the celebrated director who had once dominated the box office. Many observers interpreted the event simply as the result of personal mistakes. Others speculated that the enormous controversy surrounding the film had amplified the scrutiny placed on his life. Whatever the explanation, Gibson's career would never fully return to its previous position. Jim Caviezel also experienced unexpected consequences after portraying Jesus. Before the film, he had been steadily building a strong acting career in major Hollywood productions. But after The Passion of the Christ, many of those opportunities seemed to disappear. Some industry insiders suggested that studios were hesitant to cast him because the role had become so strongly associated with his public image. Playing Jesus in such an intense and controversial film had made him instantly recognizable, but it also created a challenge for filmmakers who worried audiences might struggle to see him as any other character. Caviezel himself later acknowledged that several people had warned him before filming began that portraying Christ might permanently change his career. In interviews years later, he recalled being told that Hollywood might stop calling once the movie was released. Despite that possibility, he said he accepted the role because he believed the story itself was more important than the potential consequences. Caviezel himself remained open about how deeply the experience had affected him spiritually. Other members of the cast described similar transformations. Luca Lionello, the Italian actor who portrayed Judas, later revealed that he had been an atheist before working on the film. After participating in the production, he said the experience led him toward Christianity. Crew members who had arrived on set with little interest in religion found themselves reading biblical texts between takes. Some said that the emotional intensity of recreating the crucifixion story forced them to confront ideas about faith and sacrifice that they had never seriously considered before. Some even requested baptism during the filming process. Perhaps the most intriguing detail is the silence that has surrounded many of the people involved in the production. Over the years, numerous extras and crew members have declined interview requests about the experience, not because of scandal or secrecy, but because they say the memories feel too personal to revisit publicly. For them, the film was not simply another job. It was something that changed the way they saw the story they were helping bring to life. And for many of the people who were there, the emotional weight of that experience has never completely faded. A film that still raises questions. Nearly 2 decades later, The Passion of the Christ remains one of the most debated religious films ever made. It was rejected by major studios, financed independently, filmed under unusual circumstances, and released through an unconventional promotional strategy. And yet, it became a global phenomenon. For some viewers, it was simply a powerful piece of cinema. For others, it felt like something far more profound. A confrontation with suffering, belief, and the historical foundations of faith. The film forced audiences to confront the crucifixion story in a way that many had never experienced before. Instead of presenting the events as distant religious symbolism, it placed viewers directly inside the brutality and emotional weight described in the gospel narratives. For believers, the film became a deeply personal reflection on sacrifice and redemption. For critics and historians, it sparked intense conversations about how ancient religious stories should be portrayed in modern media. Even today, discussions about the film continue in churches, universities, and film schools. Some people praise it as one of the most powerful depictions of the crucifixion ever put on screen, while others argue that its graphic realism pushed the limits of what audiences were prepared to see in a religious film. Few movies in modern history have managed to generate that level of cultural conversation so many years after their release, which raises a question that still lingers today. Was The Passion of the Christ simply a controversial film, or did the story behind its creation reveal something deeper about the power that certain stories still hold over the modern world? What do you think really happened behind the scenes of The Passion of the Christ? Do you believe the strange events surrounding the film were just coincidences, or something more? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy documentaries that explore the hidden stories behind history, cinema, and belief, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep investigations just like this one.